I'm talking to you, those numbers are about the children that have been forcibly deported, rather like the Nazis did, in the 1930s. But actually, there are also lots of children that are in the occupied territories. So 20% of Ukraine is occupied by Russia. And some of those children have got stuck there while their parents are on the other side. For example, I talked to fathers who went to fight for Ukraine and said goodbye to their children 3 years ago when the full-scale invasion happened. And now those places got occupied quite quickly afterwards, and they have no way of getting the children back. So they're absolutely pulling their hair out.
Well, Christina Lamb is the Sunday Times Chief Foreign Correspondent and has been writing about the often forgotten voices of war, including the thousands of Ukrainian children reported missing, believed to have been removed to Russia, and also the Ukrainian women who've suffered sexual violence being used against them as a weapon of war. Christina joins us now. Very good afternoon from us. Christina, the piece is available to anybody who's got a subscription to the Times. If they didn't get the paper yesterday, they can go back and read it. I would urge that people do, because really this conversation about children and women, it often falls off the agenda, doesn't it? And it is really important to remember. So can you just fill us in on some of the horrific figures about how many children are missing? Let's start there.
Absolutely. Well, to me, one of the most chilling aspects of this war is the fact that the Russians have abducted thousands of Ukrainian children. We don't exactly know how many. The official Ukrainian number is about 20,000, but that's only people who've actually reported children missing. It could be much more than that, because one of the things the Russians did was go into orphanages and completely empty them out, also hospitals. Ukraine had one of the highest numbers of orphanages in Europe, so there were a lot of children, just taken wholesale, that we just don't know about. So we have actually no idea exactly how many, only that it's at least 20,000, which is a lot, of which about 1,200 have now been rescued. But it's an incredibly complex thing to do. And basically, it seems that the Russians are farming these children out for adoption. It's partly because of a kind of ethnic cleansing of Ukraine, but also to help their own demographics, because the Slavic population is reducing, but also as a sort of weapon against the Ukrainians, punishment, taking the children.
So how old might some of these children be? Are we talking about very young children? Are we talking about teenagers?
Yeah. All ages. I mean, the ones that have been rescued have been teenagers, because they're the ones that have been able to be in contact, that might have had phones. And some of those who I've written about before were lured by, their schools in occupied areas. They were told that they could go to a summer camp in Crimea or a football camp for a couple of weeks, that it would be a sort of holiday, and so the entire class would be taken, or hundreds of pupils in some cases, and then they never came back, and then the parents were just stuck trying to find, not having a clue where they'd been taken to, because they were then moved to different places. And so, it's very hard to track them down. And then in the cases of the youngest ones, some of them, even babies, of course, they have no way that they're going to make contact, or so they could be lost. And really, in all this discussion now, with Donald Trump talking about peace talks with Putin, it feels as though these children may just be forgotten entirely, because there's been no discussion of them. And so, the parents are really worried that they may never see their children again.
It is quite mind-boggling to imagine the pain that the families are feeling, and also the pain that these children will feel on knowing more further on in their lives. But it's a simple fact that this just isn't on a table anywhere, is it? And
No,
you
it's
point
absolutely.
out in your piece that while Trump has been eager to discuss acquiring Ukraine's rare earth minerals as compensation for American provision of weapons, there's been no mention of the children. And I mean, apart from anything else, Christina, it does make a mockery of a guy who claims that family is everything.
Absolutely. And I mean, I'm talking to you, those numbers are about the children that have been forcibly deported, rather like the Nazis did, in the 1930s. But actually, there are also lots of children that are in the occupied territories. So 20% of Ukraine is occupied by Russia. And some of those children have got stuck there while their parents are on the other side. For example, I talked to fathers who went to fight for Ukraine and said goodbye to their children 3 years ago when the full-scale invasion happened. And now those places got occupied quite quickly afterwards, and they have no way of getting the children back. So they're absolutely pulling their hair out. One of the people I spoke to, he's actually quit the army because he wants to get his child back, and says, if I don't do it, no one else is going to do it. He doesn't know how he's going to do it, but
No, I mean, it's hard to imagine how you do it. You're looking for a living needle in a haystack, aren't you? And these are war crimes, Christina, aren't they?
yes, absolutely. The Geneva Convention, it clearly the protection of children is extremely important. And you might remember the International Criminal Court actually issued arrest warrants against Putin and his children's commissioner, Maria Lvov-Belova, who herself took one of these children. And one of the main reasons for the arrest warrant was this abduction of children, because it is such a heinous war crime.
We can't forget about the other victims in this conflict, women who've suffered sexual violence as a weapon of war. Will we ever know how widespread this has been?
It's difficult because it's hard for women to come forward and talk about it. I mean, it's hard for women anywhere to come forward and talk about this. As we know, even in this country, rape is the one crime where the victim is often made to feel that they did something wrong, and that it's very difficult to get any kind of conviction. So a lot of people feel it's not worth reporting it. So although there's been a lot of women, thousands of women have called hotlines in Ukraine to talk about this happening to them, the actual number that have made official reports is small. I believe it's only about 140, 150, and because they feel that they will be castigated by society, made to feel shame, or that there's just no point because nothing will happen.
We talk often about how difficult the diplomatic situation is since President Trump first started talking about his vision of solving the war in Ukraine. And Keir Starmer heads to Washington on Thursday to walk that tightrope. But realistically, Christina, if these kind of things aren't on the table, diplomatic position or otherwise, then we are complicit, aren't we?
Absolutely. I mean, I get very angry about this everywhere because justice is always the last thing to be thought about in peace negotiations, as are women. Not, I think partly because rarely women are sitting at the table. Yet again, here we're talking about, just white men sitting, speaking to each other about it, even though half the society is women. And so until you actually have women at the table discussing this, I think this issue always gets forgotten or sidelined, as if it's somehow less important than anything else. And, that is completely not the case. This is a horrific thing. And actually, in the case of Ukraine, President Zelensky himself has talked about the rape, sexual violence in the same breath as the torture and killing and the need. And they have got war crimes investigators trying to track down perpetrators, trying to collect information. But it's really difficult because we're talking about tens of thousands of war crimes around the country, if you include everything, not least all the schools that have been attacked, hospitals. And this all while a war is going on. So it is really difficult to do.
And absolutely, and as you've said, often, particularly with rape, it can be an invisible crime, invisible to the people who are trying to find out more about what's happened through no fault of the victim. Before we leave you, Christina, I know you've been writing about the British couple arrested by the Taliban in Afghanistan. Their daughter, Sarah Entwistle, was talking to Times Radio earlier this morning.
We chose not to involve the British consulate, hoping to hear directly from the Taliban about why they'd arrested our parents. Our parents have always sought to honour the Taliban, so we wanted to give them the opportunity to explain their reasons for this detention. However, after more than 3 weeks of silence, we can no longer wait. We're now urgently calling on the British consulate to do everything in their power to get us answers and to put as much pressure as they can on the Taliban for their release.
So that's an interesting term, isn't it? They're everything in their power. I mean, what power does the British consulate actually have in Afghanistan, do you think, at the moment, Christina?
I mean, there actually isn't a British consulate in Afghanistan because the UK, like every other country in the world, doesn't recognise the Taliban. And so we closed our embassy when the Taliban took over in August 2021 and have never reopened it. We have somebody in Doha who represents and travels back and forth. But so, the power to actually do anything is frankly quite limited. On the other hand, there were some British arrested before that were held by the Taliban, and the government did manage to negotiate their release. So we have to hope that they will be able to do the same with this couple. I mean, at the moment, we have no idea why exactly they were arrested. We're kind of assuming that it's because the training center they had was teaching women motherhood skills. And as you know, the Taliban think that women should basically not venture out from their homes and not do anything at all, not even be seen out the window, and certainly not be heard speaking out loud or learning anything. So I guess that this was frowned upon, but their children say that the parents, were very careful to do everything in line with what the Taliban was allowing them to do. So, but they've had no contact now for almost 3 weeks, as Sarah, their daughter, said. So obviously it's very worrying for them.
Christina, always good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed for your time. That's Christina Lamb. And if you want to go back and read that piece, it's so important about all of the things that have happened to some of the women in Ukraine and children there too. Then you can do that by going to thetimes.com.